Luke chapter 14, verse 1 and 7 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Please pray with me. Holy God, from age to age, we turn around and realize that our lives might have gone farther away from how you have taught us to live. We have moments and ages of faithfulness to your ways of living, and moments and ages when it seems like we forget the beautiful ways that you have taught us to live. We sometimes replace your abundance and generosity with greed and scarcity, ignoring that you have made creation for the benefit of all living things, not just for ourselves. When we respond to your gifts with generosity toward others, everyone has what they need. In the words of the psalmist, we have the finest wheat and honey from the rock. Remind us that hospitality to strangers is how we all survive and thrive. That Jesus taught us clearly that sharing and doing good for one another are pleasing to you. We seek to hear your good news, that both friend and stranger are your beloved people, and that blessing of those in need means blessing for everyone. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I imagine that most of us have had times when we felt awkward at a meal time, even if we have to think back to the most awkward age we have probably been in our teenage years, when maybe the popular kids ignored our need for a place to sit in the lunchroom, or even in our families when we felt awkward about being around anyone. Or we might have memories when someone made us embarrassed in front of someone we might have had a crush on in a social situation and felt humiliated or rejected by those around us. We all want to feel welcome. And sometimes tables and meals are those places where we can either feel like we are embraced or we can feel like we are rejected. They are places that we know that we need most to be embraced and welcomed. The gospel text today is from Luke's gospel. In it we hear about Jesus' invitation to eat at the table of a Pharisee, a leader of the Pharisees. Now, often we have heard the stories about the Pharisees and think that they're bad people, though really if you look at what the Pharisees are doing, some of them are just questioning Jesus to figure out who he is. Some of it sounds kind of challenging, but I'm pretty sure that that's just how life was, and sometimes is in certain circles. Who are you, and how can you say what you're saying? Tell us what it all means. In today's text, though, one of the Pharisees has invited Jesus' table fellowship, which means to a certain extent, there's a level of welcome there. You didn't invite anyone to your table. You didn't invite those you thought were unclean to your table. So there was a certain amount of welcome already involved when Jesus was invited. It was one way of showing Jesus was welcome to the conversation in the Jewish faith of his day. So in the part of the text that we read, Jesus sat at the table and he seemed to notice some awkwardness as people began to find their seats, or at least an awareness of where you sit tells people what your social status is. So he began to tell them a parable. Now, as you probably know, parables aren't just stories. They aren't even just stories with a moral or a lesson. Jesus' parables usually involve some kind of unexpected element for those who were the first listeners. And sometimes those elements contain a level of humor. The parable Jesus begins with is one that we might see a little bit humorous. If we imagine the scene, we could see someone who finds themselves to be important. We imagine a pompous person, perhaps, who thinks, I'm the most important person here, so I'm going to sit in the most important place. Now, that probably immediately sets us up to understand that that's probably not going to be the way the story ends. But then the guest that the host finds the most important arrives, and the self-important one has to be humbled or taken down a notch when they're asked to move. Jesus said, instead, humble yourself to begin with by taking a place that you would consider unwelcome or the lowest by the host, and then perhaps you'll be raised up a little bit in status. You'll be asked to move higher up. Okay, it's not a very good joke, but it's a joke. Today, there aren't very many times when we would find ourselves in this situation. I guess there's very few places in our world where we have this formality of status. But there are places where we usually know better than to sit at the main table, maybe a wedding. The wedding party usually have the high seats in one way of talking, and we wouldn't try to go sit where the bride and groom are supposed to sit, even if those are the only spaces available when we walk into the room. But the parable, of course, doesn't just apply to meal times. That's just sort of the most obvious example. This kind of awkward self-importance that Jesus seems to have noticed can happen almost anywhere. And the kind of hospitality that Jesus encourages also can happen in any situation. We can open ourselves to the possibilities of humbling ourselves for the sake of new experiences. We can be hospitable to both guest and host alike by being friendly and helpful to everyone, whatever we might think is the status of the host or the guest. Eating together, being social together, continues to be one of the most complicated times in human relationships. Those times of social eating, as I said, can make us feel welcome and cheerful and a part of the group, or they can make us feel outside, possibly rejected. Jesus then changes his focus to hosts and parties and celebration. He begins to speak to the fellow Pharisee who has invited him to eat. And Jesus says to him, instead of getting friends and family together all the time, people who can repay your hospitality, we should invite those who are not able to repay us. Those who can share themselves are invited to do just that, and those who find themselves to be self-important will find themselves humbled and maybe humiliated. And those who want to impress the people they know best are supposed to show generosity to the people that nobody really thinks about impressing, and possibly the people that nobody really even notices are around. The other day I heard a story about a group that gives out bags with soap and wet wipes, other kinds of things, snack and water and other items for those who are unhoused or maybe just spend their days on the streets because they don't have a place to go during part of the day. One person was given one of those bags and responded, when they were asked if they would like one, they responded, anything that you give me will be a blessing. And while I believe that's true, and I know that the intention of fulfilling a need is a gift, I also hope that in that conversation with people who are in need, there's actually a conversation about what it is exactly that they do need. There are many out there who desperately do need the simple things that we can offer, simple nourishment that food brings. They struggle to buy enough food or the kinds of food that their health demands. That's very true of many, even in this nation of abundant resources, and particularly true for children in our nation. And there are also many who don't just need the nourishment that meals provide, not just the food, they also need connections and relationships that most of us enjoy on a regular basis with those we love and like to be with. We might not get those connections all of the time, but when we do have an opportunity, we do enjoy those times together with family and friends sometimes. Though many of us do enjoy our own company, many people suffer from the loneliness that comes from too much time without connection to others. We have enough to eat, and we still need those times together with friends and family. Jesus teaches, it seems, both of those kinds of table manners and issues several kinds of invitations here. He sees these meals as wonderful opportunities to demonstrate the love and welcome that God gives, enjoying the invitation for ourselves. He also understands that essential and nutritious meals are times to do even more. They are times to receive invitation to service to others, finding ways to meet needs and create tables of welcome in various ways. Because, as I said, meals eaten together do more than nourish our bodies, they nourish our spirits. Once, a long time ago, a couple were traveling through the small town where I lived, and they needed some financial help. They'd stopped for gas money, and they also wanted money for a meal. So I asked if they'd like to eat lunch with me because I was about to head that way, and I would get them gas after the meal. They told me a very sparse story about why they were on the road, traveling to visit a sick relative or something like that. After we ate together, they opened up more about who they were, and they opened up more about their own spiritual beliefs. I hadn't asked any more questions, but there was something about eating together that created a more trusted relationship among us, and so they shared a little bit more than they had before. I may not have gotten the entire story even then, I know that, but I heard more truth after the meal than I had heard before. I felt I haven't had a lot of opportunity to do that, but when I have taken those times, I felt like something genuine happened. I don't know if there was any long-lasting effect to the situation, but I do believe that the love of God was shared when we gathered together like that, even if we didn't talk about it. I won't even say it was awkward exactly before or after the meal. I don't know if they remember it, but it made a difference to me. So we know that we are nourished by food and by the company we keep. People who need us can often help us understand our own needs and realize that when we hear different stories, we also understand one another better. All kinds of different people who there are in the world. I confess that as an introvert, I do struggle to engage people, but stories like the one I told help me to see that even connecting with one or two people at a time can be a very profound experience of welcome and generosity for everyone involved. Sharing with those in need can help us be a part of lives, whether or not we sit in fellowship with all those, our small contributions help. In our culture, so unlike the one where Jesus lived, we can find creative ways. We have to find creative ways to be more open, to open tables, to experiences of welcome. We might read and discover ways to raise our voices for a living wage so that more children receive the amount and kinds of foods that they need for a good future, as one small example. We can raise our voices knowing that, as one prayer says, enveloped in God's care, secured by God's call, we are making a place at the table for all. to the glory of our welcoming and sustaining God. Amen.